Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks, and today we have a presentation of my favorite president of all time, Lyndon B Johnson. So let's get this presentation started, see what we can learn from President Johnson. It's going to be some historical value to him, I figure. So, starting off, nobody actually says Lyndon Baines Johnson. I mean, who would say that? We mostly refer to him by his initials, LBJ. So, when people talk about Johnson, they talk about LBJ. Now, he was in the White House from 63 to 1969. Now, you can say that's kind of a weird set of numbers. Now, why would that be? Mostly because he didn't serve two full terms. He took over for Kennedy after Kennedy was shot for about a year and a half and then served his own term until 1969. At that point, pretty much he was so unpopular because of his role with starting the Vietnam War that he's going to be kicked out of office, or his term is going to be up and no longer reelected. Now, let's kind of review context. How did we get to Johnson? Well, in 1928, we had Herbert Hoover, and then for four terms, we had FDR. And then FDR died at the end of World War II, and Truman finished World War II, served out three and a half years of FDR's term, got his own term, and then was replaced in 1953 by President Eisenhower. Eisenhower is going to be hit in the face by the 22nd Amendment because he served 8 years and can't serve more. And after him is going to be Kennedy. Kennedy is going to be assassinated and ultimately be replaced by our guy today, Lyndon Johnson. So let's talk about Lyndon Johnson's presidency. It's going to be a little bit of a long journey. Now, in 1908, Lyndon Johnson is going to be born in the great state of Texas. And he's going to be a cute baby, apparently. And then, of course, he's going to become a school teacher. I believe he is the only president we've ever had that was a full-time teacher. Now, that said, that's going to impact Johnson because as a teacher, he taught very, very poor students. And that's going to generate lifelong empathy for people that are stuck with abject poverty. And that is going to direct his presidency about how he wanted to help people by taking on poverty. Well, anyway, as time goes by, besides being a teacher, he says, I can help people by becoming a member of Congress. I'm going to help people by becoming a member of the House of Representatives. And he does that. He has success, so he says, I'm going to try to gain a little more power. I'm going to switch to the other side of Congress, which is the U.S. Senate. Because there's only 100 members of the U.S. Senate, it's a much more powerful place to be. So he becomes a member of the Senate, and then within the Senate, he gains power. He moves up and becomes the leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate. Now, the leader of the Democratic Party is known as the Majority Leader, and they are essentially like the coach of the political party known as the Democrats, and he's in charge. And if you're the Majority Leader, you're the one that controls all the bills passed. You talk to the media, and ultimately he's going to pass so many bills, he's going to go down in history as one of the greatest senators in the history of the country. So that said, he passes a lot of bills. So with all of that credibility, he decides to run for president in 1960. He's going to lose not to the Republican nominee, Nixon, but actually to the Democratic nominee, John F. Kennedy. He's going to lose in the primaries, and Kennedy is going to be the Democratic nominee. But Kennedy knows that Kennedy has a weakness, that the South doesn't like him, and Democrats are going to have trouble in 1960 winning the presidency without the support of the South. And why does the South dislike Kennedy? Well, they saw him as snobbish, New England elite that had tons of money, rich guy, went to Harvard, again, kind of a snob. He was Catholic when the South was predominantly white and Protestant. And ultimately, Kennedy says, all right, the way for me to win over the South is to have a running mate, a vice presidential candidate that's from the South. And that will help him win the South, which he needs for the presidency. So Kennedy chooses Johnson as his running mate. And together they defeat Nixon and his running mate in the 1960 presidential election. It's going to be the closest in, I think, about 100 years. And Kennedy and Johnson will be elected presidential elect and vice president elect. Good for them. So Kennedy's going to be in the White House for about 2.5 years until he's assassinated. Johnson is going to be vice president for that time. And on November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, Kennedy gets assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. At least that's what the Warren Commission leads us to believe. So at this point, Kennedy is assassinated. That day on Air Force One, Johnson gets sworn in as our next president. Notice Jackie Kennedy, wife of the dead John F. Kennedy, right next to him. So that said, transfer of power complete in a peaceful way. So let's see what we can learn from Johnson's presidency, what we can learn from a little bit of history. So kind of decision number one that Johnson had to make, let's build up to it. Johnson gave a speech that said, the United States is the richest country in the history of the world. It should be able to create a greater society, a great society. And this name is going to be attached to all of his ideas and all of his programs, just like the New Deal was FDR's and the Fair Deal was Truman's, the New Frontier was Kennedy's. All of the ideas of Johnson are going to be known as the Great Society programs. So the U.S. Congress it's going to be a unique time in history because normally we have split government. The Republicans have control of part of it, the Democrats have control of part of it, so they have to constantly compromise and they don't get a lot done. But in this case, there was no split. The Democrats dominated the U.S. Senate, 68-32, and the Democrats dominated the House of Representatives, 295 to 140. And in those two houses, you only need 51 and 218 votes to get laws passed. The Democrats had so much more than that. It basically meant that Johnson could get pretty much anything he wanted passed. And so he's going to say, this is the time to make a difference. Unconditional war on poverty is what he says. We're going to take out poverty, pass a massive amount of laws, 181 laws to take out poverty, and he's going to try to make a difference. Now, these laws all weren't successful, but we're going to talk about some of them and see what they did, the difference they could have made. Now, should it be a top priority of government to fight against poverty? That's a huge question. Some people say we're a capitalist society. You should leave people to fight it out for themselves. The government shouldn't get involved. This should be laissez-faire. That the reason people are poor is because they are weak or they're lazy or they have character issues, and therefore the government shouldn't be trying to help them. Why take money away from the rich who are working to create programs to help the lazy? That people, when they get helped, they become lazy. They can't take care of themselves because they get used to other people taking care of themselves. But other people say that's not what poverty is. Poverty is basically not a character issue, that life is inherently unfair, that there are people that are unprivileged and they get stuck in the cycle of poverty. And ultimately, that's not fair. That's why the government has to try to level the playing field by creating programs to help people that are poor. So Johnson definitely believed that and said, I'm going to help these people, get them on their feet so they can be productive U.S. citizens to help mitigate their suffering and so on. Now, decision number 2 for Johnson. Well, the United States and the Soviet Union were in the middle of a race, and that race was the space race. Both were spending trillions of dollars to try to get to the moon. After all, John F. Kennedy said we were going to get to the moon first, and we were going to get to it by the end of the decade. So we created the Apollo program to do exactly that, to develop space technology to put the first man on the moon, mankind, that is. Now, why is the Apollo program good? Well, it raised morale. The U.S. was really, really sad when the Soviet Union put the first satellite up, Sputnik, in 1957. Yuri Gagarin, the first human being in space in 1961. And the U.S. felt like we were so far behind, and that's going to be a terrible thing. So that said, America wanted to prove that we were number one. We were the smartest, and technology-wise, we're the best. And if we work on technology to get to the moon, there's going to be spin-off technologies. That technology that's going to help us get to the moon, like things like GPS, can be used for everyday life for U.S. citizens. So it's going to help us. We were competing for the respect of third world countries so that they would respect us and love us more than the Soviet Union. That way, economically and militarily, they would ally with us, which would help our situation if we ever got into a war. These were all good reasons for us to win over the hearts and minds of the world by showing we were awesome by getting to the moon first. But some people were against the Apollo program. It was throwing money away. Billions of dollars, trillions of dollars. We have so many poor people suffering down on Earth. Why waste that money getting to the moon? In fact, the Apollo program had so many missions to get to the moon. Apollo 1, 3 astronauts died because there was a fire in the capsule that they couldn't escape. So my question here is, with so many problems on Earth, should the U.S. really pay trillions of dollars to get to space? I mean, this is still happening in 2024, right? We're still spending this money. Wouldn't that money be better served helping people that are suffering right here? And of course, that is a challenging and difficult question to answer. That said, the world always has its problems. That doesn't mean we should back down from trying to go outside of our comfort zone and explore the world, right? Imagine if Christopher Columbus turned back and said, we should focus this time on improving Europe and not going to the New World. Well, the New World would look very, very different than it did today. Perhaps even with problems, we should try to explore and do what we can. I don't know. But decision 3. Johnson's also going to pass a law called the Wilderness Act of 1964. He's going to take 91 million acres of U.S. federal property, which was a lot, and designate it cannot be leased or given out to U.S. businesses to exploit, to serve for business interests, to clear cut for the timber, or to mine. So all of this U.S. land cannot be mined by businesses. You can't build roads or tiny little communities. You can't build shops. To understand this, the largest landowner in the United States is the U.S. government. and it forever always leases this land out to businesses so they can use it. Now, why do they do that? Well, to help the economy. The U.S. has tons of resources that businesses can use for our factories, and it's just a necessary way to fuel our economy. But Johnson was like, our land is so unbelievably beautiful. We need to stop letting businesses exploit and destroy it and clear cut the forests and mine and destroy mountains to get these raw materials. No, we have to preserve the most beautiful aspects of nature. But anyway, the opposite view is, oh my God, we need these resources for businesses to use this land to create jobs and to create money. These jobs provide paychecks, to provide food for kids. So again, the question here is, should the U.S. government, like Johnson did, protect the environment, even if it results in a loss of jobs and the hurting of the economy because the businesses can't use that land to get resources? Johnson absolutely, under the Wilderness Act, protected that land, which probably hurt the economy a little bit. So what do you favor, protecting the environment or serving the economy by allowing the environment to be utilized for resources? I don't know. Well, anyway, decision number 4 for Johnson. The next 3 decisions are going to be immigration related, and immigration is always a really hot topic. In the late 1800s, the United States was dominated much by very white Protestant people that had come here from Northern and Western Europe. And those people started to develop a little bit of racism and nativism, noticing that immigrants were coming in and changing the makeup of the United States. They wanted the U.S. to stay very white and Protestant with white Northwestern European culture. Now, that said, they noticed Asian immigrants coming in very high quantities after the building of railroads and the discovery of gold in the Western United States. So in 1882, under the Chinese Exclusion Act, the United States passed a law that said immigrants can come in from all countries except China, a very racist and terrible law. In 1917, to stop the flow of immigration, it became a requirement that literacy tests had to be passed in order to come in. And the only people that could pass literacy tests in English were people from Northern and Western Europe because of their higher levels of education, and many of them had spoken English. So that was a way to decrease non-European immigration. In 1921, another immigration act completely was to slow down immigration, just to lower the quantity. And one of the ways it did that was it established quotas from every country in the world, saying we will only accept a tiny amount of people next year and every year after that for immigration. But they had the highest quotas from Northwestern Europe to keep immigrants white and Protestant, English speaking as well. And in 1924, the National Origins Act is another immigration law that basically lowered those quotas and even lowered the one from Japan to 0. We already weren't accepting immigrants from China. Now the immigrants from Japan went down to 0. So again, this National Origins Act is going to be entirely racist and whatnot, and really change the nature of immigration for the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and 60s. But that brings us to 1965 with a new sheriff in town, and that would be Lyndon B Johnson. And he's going to pass a new immigration law, 1965 immigration law, and that's going to take the quotas established in the 1920s and got rid of them. Said from now on, immigrants can come here on a first-come, first-served basis, a much more equitable process. No more discrimination against certain immigrants just because they came from certain countries. No more. China and Japan could now come in, first come, first serve. Immigrants now welcome. So my question is, when it comes to immigration, is it acceptable for the United States to favor certain nationalities over others? It certainly did all the way to 1965. Johnson got rid of that. The argument would be that the United States has some things more in common with some cultures than others. Perhaps the United States would favor letting more immigrants in from countries that have more in common with us. But the other argument that Johnson would use is that's a very racist nativist policy, that we benefit from greater diversity, not less, and that making those generalizations and stereotypes about entire nations is discriminatory and unfair. And that's why Johnson got rid of those regulations and changes. So yes, either way, make up your own mind, have a point of view on that type of policy. Decision number 5, also about immigration. The United States was facing high amounts of immigration during the time of Johnson, and we only could allow so many immigrants per year. The United States is a very popular place. So many people want to come here. So we only allow a certain percentage. Everybody else has to continue waiting or maybe even not ever get into the United States. Johnson passed the 1965 Immigration Act, which got rid of national quotas for national origins, yes, but established that skilled people with skills like being engineers or physicists, they can cut the line and they can get in before unskilled people. Now, in terms of immigration policy, should the U.S. allow skilled immigrants to cut the line and come in over unskilled labor? Now, some people say yes. If we are only allowing a certain number of immigrants to come in, Why not allow immigrants that have great skills that can improve the skill labor of the United States? Other people say this is discriminatory. The United States should use immigration to help vulnerable populations who want to create better lives for themselves. Why should we be heartless and only allow people in that already have great lives and great skills? We should be using it to help and save people, just like that was what the US was for generations ago, as people came here, huddled masses yearning to be free to support them. So that we should continue our tradition of letting immigrants in that desperately need help and are looking for a better life. Whatever the answer is, you should have a point of view. But decision number 6, 1965, once again, the United States had a massive number of immigrants coming in. And Johnson passed the 65 Immigration Act, which got rid of national origin quotas, but also prioritized skilled labor versus unskilled labor. Well, this law also created a prioritized family members to coming in as immigrants. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, the top priority under Johnson's 1965 bill, if you could prove that you had a family member that was already a U.S. citizen, maybe a spouse or a child or a parent or an uncle or aunt, you are now the priority for letting in. In fact, this process was often called chain immigration. That one member of a family would come in, and that would slowly bring the entire family in, and that was a good example of migration. So that said, in terms of immigration policy, should the U.S. allow family members to be given the absolute priority when it comes to cutting line to migrate to the United States? A lot of people feel complicated because these people are going to push other people back in the line, people that have been waiting for longer to become U.S. citizens. That said, moving forward, decision number 7 under the Johnson regime, the United States will always battle against poverty. That's the thing. And poverty is awful because people sometimes don't even have enough money to eat. And in the richest country in the history of the world should not have problem feeding its population. So Johnson established the Food Stamp Act of 1964 that said no matter how poor somebody is, the United States government will take care of them and at least give them substance, give them food. We're not going to give them money because they could spend that in terrible ways. So no, but we are going to give them food, and we're going to give that in the form of stamps. So basically, people will have stamps or stickers essentially and can go to grocery stores and redeem them for food. And today we don't use those anymore because now we can use the technology of a card. And every year and every week that more money will be put on it by the federal government. And this will allow poor people and lower middle class people under the poverty line to basically eat and their children to eat. It is a great, great help of vulnerable populations. Can you imagine down on your luck losing your job and now you can't feed your family? What a horrific thing. And the U.S. government takes care of that by providing food to the people that are poor. Now, some people argue against this. They say, I pay for my own food because I work hard. These people clearly don't work hard. Why should billions of my money go to them? And some people say if you keep helping people that are suffering, they will never learn to help themselves. It sounds like Herbert Hoover's ghost coming back to us. So anyway, should U.S. tax dollars be spent to pay for food stamps of Americans who are afflicted with poverty? And of course, you should have an opinion about that. That program still exists today. It's now called SNAP, not food stamps, but still. Now, decision number 8. In 1964, the U.S. economy started to go down. Johnson got nervous. So he passed the Revenue Act of 1964, and that took taxes, and what did it do with them? It lowered them, cut taxes. Now, who did it lower taxes mostly for? Well, most people that pay the highest amount of taxes are wealthy people. They have more to pay, so they do. And particularly in the 50s and 60s and 70s, tax rates were really high on the wealthy. So who do we lower taxes for? The wealthy. And by how much? The wealthy, the highest rate that they were at went from 91% to 70%. And this Revenue Act of 1964, U.S. businesses went from 52% to paying 48%. Today it's closer to 20%. Now, this is basically known as Keynesian economics, named after John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, who basically in the 1920s and 30s said the best way to stimulate your economy is to lower taxes, to give your populace more money, and that money can be spent, and when it's spent, it will create jobs for people. And the best way to do that is to cut taxes. Often for the wealthy, they can reinvest in their businesses, expand their businesses. Not only does that help their businesses become profitable, but it also helps create jobs for the middle class and poor. So everybody is helped. So the best way to help the economy is stimulate the wealthy people in the economy. Now, the problem, though, is when you lower taxes like Johnson did in 1964, the government now has less money, and that's called deficit spending because they're going to have to spend money they don't have and go into debt. And that some people see as a problem. But anyway, if you are going to lower taxes, should the U.S. government cut taxes on the wealthy or on the non-wealthy with the hopes of stimulating the economy. And you should have an opinion on that. Johnson cut taxes for the wealthy for the most part. Now, that said, decision number 9. In 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald is going to order a gun. And he orders it through the mail, and through the mail he receives it, and he kills John F. Kennedy. So Johnson helps pass a law called the Gun Control Act of 1968, which is going to do 3 things. First thing it does is from now on, you cannot get guns through a mail order form. You can't. You got to buy them in person. Hopefully that could have stopped Oswald. It's too late. Number 2, the Gun Control Act of 1968 was the first time that we said that anybody that is convicted of domestic violence against a member of their family, could be a spouse or a child, for the rest of your life, you're not allowed to get a gun. Because often people that are beating up their families often eventually can use firearms to escalate and do terrible, terrible things. So, and finally, the Gun Control Act of 1968 under Johnson says that felons, who are convicted of violent crimes for the rest of their lives, even after they get out of prison, cannot get firearms. Now, we're talking about felons who have served their debt to society, did something wrong, but completely paid their debt to society, served 5 or 10 years or whatever, and now we say that they're free to start their life over. But this law is going to take their right to get weapons away for the rest of their lives. Felons cannot have their gun privileges gone. Second Amendment no longer apply. So some people think that's fair because often violent felons reoffend. Other people say no, they've paid their debt to society and they should be free to be regular citizens with all the rights of regular citizens. You should have an opinion. Now, come in 1964, Johnson is going to need some votes. He's going to run for president, right? And he's going to be in an election against a guy named Barry Goldwater, who's the Republican. Barry Goldwater famously said, communism is spreading everywhere. Vietnam is an example. So ultimately in Vietnam, what Barry Goldwater says is we need to use nuclear weapons. It's one of our weapons in our arsenal to stop the spread of communism. I mean, why are we ignoring the best weapon that we have? Communism spreading in Vietnam. Let's bomb North Vietnam. And of course, there was one thing that Barry Goldwater said is that extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, no terrible thing. Because President Johnson was calling Goldwater an extremist. He's going to bomb everybody and destroy lives and so on. But Goldwater's like, listen, we're defending freedom. I'm going to be extreme, and that's a good thing. So, this is a video that Johnson put during the 64 election. Her nickname is Daisy. She's picking flowers off of a daisy. Basically saying that Barry Goldwater is going to kill us all. That's known as the famous Daisy ad, making Goldwater seem like, the most evil guy ever. And Goldwater's going to lose that election. The Republican loses, and Johnson is going to win the election overwhelmingly. A huge butt kicking, or landslide as we call it, 486 to 52. Popular vote. He's going to also crush it by winning 61% of the country. That's a huge victory and it's going to allow the Great Society to exist. But Johnson's going to be taken down by the Vietnam War. Johnson is going to do so many programs to help the poor, but eventually his money gets siphoned off to pay for the Vietnam War, and that's going to make him miserable and unpopular, and people are going to hate him, and his programs are going to start to fail because they're going to be underfunded. And in the end, people are going to think Johnson. So that was basically a huge chant was, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Because in the Vietnam War, there was talk of villages getting burned and atrocities and young Vietnamese people being killed. But also they referred to the kids as the 18 and 19-year-old Americans that were dying at a huge pace over there in Vietnam, right? So again, the Great Society was a great thing, but it's ultimately going to be destroyed and bankrupted by the Vietnam War. Johnson's going to be so hated and miserable in 1968 as he's running for president in the New Hampshire primary. He's going to go up against a nobody named Eugene McCarthy. And ultimately, Eugene McCarthy is going to get 44% of the vote against a sitting president. That's unheard of. So Johnson's like, if Eugene McCarthy can beat me, then I have no hope. And then Bobby Kennedy saw that Johnson was that weak. And Bobby Kennedy entered the race, the brother of John F. Kennedy. And now Johnson's like, there's no way I can beat Bobby Kennedy if I can barely even beat Eugene McCarthy. So Johnson at this point is like, oh, God, I thought I did such a good job and the country hates me, even my own party. So Johnson does that speech and says, I will not run. Bobby Kennedy gets assassinated during the same election. And ultimately, Hubert Humphrey is going to be the Democratic nominee. He goes up against Richard Nixon, who's back again. Richard Nixon is going to win that election. And that's a complicated time. So ultimately, this was our presentation on Lyndon Johnson and just a small piece of his presidency and a lot of the decisions he had to make. Tune in for our next presentation on the Great Society, where we'll dive even deeper into President Johnson and the ways that he tried to help our society. Thank you and have an excellent day.